To understand the story of AMD, we must first understand the canvas they paint on. Silicon. At its core, a computer processor is not magic. It is a city built of billions of tiny switches called transistors. For 50 years, the rules of this city were dictated by a single law, Moore's Law. The company that could build the smallest switches and pack them the tightest would win. For decades, this was a game of brute force. If you wanted a faster chip, you built a bigger factory. You spent billions of dollars to shrink light waves and etch patterns smaller than a strand of DNA. But in this high-stakes game of microscopic construction, there was always one giant casting a shadow over the industry, a monopoly that defined the rules of the road. And in the shadow of that giant, a small, scrappy rival was born. Not to lead, but simply to survive. Advanced Micro Devices, or AMD, was never supposed to be the main character. In the early days of computing, IBM was the king. When IBM decided to build the personal computer, they chose Intel's architecture. But IBM had a strict rule. They would never rely on a single supplier for their most critical component. They demanded a backup, a second source. This is where AMD entered the picture. They signed a contract to manufacture Intel's chips as a safety net. For years, AMD was the little brother, legally allowed to copy Intel's homework, but never allowed to lead the class. They were the discount option, the generic brand. But this subordinate position created a unique culture at AMD. While Intel grew fat and comfortable on high margins and dominance, AMD was fighting for its life in the trenches, learning how to do more with less. And soon they would need every ounce of that grit. The turning point came when the industry faced a massive economic wall. You see, making chips is expensive. Jerry Sanders, AMD's charismatic founder, once famously said, "Real men have fabs," meaning a real chip company builds its own factories. But by the late 2000s, the cost of building a single cutting-edge factory, or fab, had skyrocketed to over $10 billion. AMD was bleeding money. They couldn't afford to keep up with Intel's manufacturing spending. So they made a radical, desperate decision. They sold their factories. They spun off their manufacturing division into a new company called Global Foundries. AMD became fabless. They would design the mind of the chip, but pay someone else, eventually TSMC, to build the body. At the time, critics called it a surrender. They said AMD was dead. But history would reveal this was not a defeat. It was the shedding of weight that would allow them to outrun the giant. Free from the burden of managing factories, AMD's engineers looked at the laws of physics and noticed a problem. Intel was still building monolithic chips. This means printing the entire processor as one giant, perfect square of silicon. But as chips became more complex, this approach hit a wall. If a single speck of dust landed on a giant chip during manufacturing, the whole thing was ruined. Their yield rates, the number of good chips per batch, were plummeting. AMD, having less money, couldn't afford to waste silicon. So they asked a first principles question. Why are we trying to bake one giant perfect cake? Why don't we bake 4 small cupcakes and tie them together? This was the birth of the chiplet architecture. Instead of one massive chip, they printed small, perfect, easy-to-make squares. If one was broken, they threw it away and kept the others. It was efficient, it was cheap. But it had one fatal flaw. How do you get the separate pieces to talk to each other fast enough? The problem with splitting a brain into 4 pieces is lag. If the left side of the brain needs to wait for the right side to answer, the computer slows down. This is where AMD's Zen architecture changed everything. They invented the Infinity Fabric. Think of Infinity Fabric as a superhighway built directly into the silicon. It allowed these separate chiplets to communicate with each other at blazing speeds, almost as if they were one single piece. This was the checkmate. While Intel was stuck struggling to manufacture impossible monolithic designs, AMD was snapping together Lego blocks. They could offer more cores and more power for half the price. Suddenly, the second source wasn't just cheaper, it was smarter. Gamers and PC enthusiasts often focus on frame rates and graphics, but the real war for the future is fought in the dark, cold aisles of data centers. This is where the cloud lives. Amazon AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud. These are the customers that matter. For these giants, the most important metric isn't just raw speed, it is efficiency. Power costs money, heat kills hardware. AMD's chiplet design, specifically their EPYC server chips, offered a massive advantage in power efficiency. They offered more cores per server rack than Intel could muster. The market share shift was dramatic. The Red Team began conquering the cloud, turning the industry's most profitable fortress into an AMD stronghold. But the story doesn't end with the CPU. We are now entering the era of artificial intelligence, and the CPU is no longer the only king in the castle. The GPU, or graphics processing unit, and specialized AI accelerators are taking the throne. Recognizing this, AMD made another massive bet. They acquired Xilinx, the leader in adaptive computing, chips that can be reprogrammed on the fly. This transformed AMD from a simple CPU manufacturer into a high-performance computing conglomerate. They are now fighting a two-front war, battling Intel for the central processor and battling NVIDIA for the future of AI. It is a precarious position, but one that puts them at the very center of the technological revolution. So, what is the lesson of AMD? It is a lesson in architectural thinking. When you cannot beat a monopoly at their own game, you must change the board. AMD realized that in the modern era, design is more valuable than manufacturing. By decoupling their ideas from their factories, and by breaking the monolithic chip into modular pieces, they architected the impossible. They proved that even in a world of silicon giants, the smartest design wins. Thank you for watching.